The millionaire rancher froze mid-stride, his coffee cup slipping from trembling fingers as he stared at the blood-soaked figure stumbling through the moonlit desert. Thomas Running Wolf had seen plenty of trouble in his 35 years, but nothing like this. It wasn't a lost traveler. It was a woman clutching a medical bag, her torn white dress gleaming like a ghost against the red Arizona dirt. His paint horse snorted and danced nervously beneath him, nostrils flaring at the scent of blood and fear. The woman's eyes rolled back as she collapsed 20 yards from his boots, her breathing shallow and desperate. Thomas's weathered hands shook as he dismounted, memories of his Apache childhood flooding back, the same helpless terror he'd felt watching his people die. This stranger's pain cut through him like a knife, awakening something he'd buried deep beneath his white man's wealth. "Dear God," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her still form. Who was she running from? And why did her unconscious face seem hauntingly familiar, like an echo from his forgotten past? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The woman's eyelids fluttered open to reveal startling green eyes that seemed to hold depths of ancient wisdom. Thomas found himself staring into a face that belonged in his grandmother's stories. High cheekbones, olive skin that spoke of mixed heritage, and lips now pale from blood loss. She tried to sit up, wincing as pain shot through her left shoulder where dark stains spread across her torn dress. "Easy there, miss," Thomas said gently, his voice carrying the soft drawl he'd learned from his adoptive family. "You're hurt bad. Let me help you." She clutched her leather medical bag protectively against her chest, studying his face with the wariness of someone who'd learned not to trust easily. "I'm Rebecca," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Rebecca Whitehorse. And I can't go back." Thomas felt his heart skip at the surname. Whitehorse, a name whispered in Apache ceremonies, a family line thought lost 20 years ago. He kept his expression neutral, though his mind raced with possibilities. "I'm Thomas Sterling. I own the Diamond S Ranch north of here. What happened to you?" Rebecca's fingers found a small leather pouch hanging from her neck, prayer beads that caught the moonlight. She fingered them unconsciously, the gesture so familiar it made Thomas's chest tighten with recognition. "They wanted to make me marry a man I'd never met. Dr. Marcus Ashworth from back east. When I refused, they said I was mentally unstable, that I needed medical treatment." Her voice broke. "I overheard them planning to have me declared incompetent so they could force the marriage." Thomas knew of Dr. Ashworth, a government medical officer whose reputation preceded him throughout the territory. The man's presence in Arizona had coincided with disturbing reports from the reservations about missing children and experimental treatments. "So you ran." "I've been traveling for 3 days, hiding during daylight, moving at night. They hired men to bring me back." Rebecca touched her wounded shoulder. "One of them found me at a water stop. When I tried to escape, She gestured weakly at the blood. Thomas studied her face in the silver moonlight, noting the determined set of her jaw despite her exhaustion. This wasn't some pampered Eastern woman having vapors. This was a fighter. The medical bag, her steady hands despite the trauma, the way she'd automatically checked her own wound for severity, she had training. "You're a doctor," he said. It wasn't a question. "Nurse. Trained at Massachusetts General Hospital, though they didn't know I was there. I disguised myself as a man for the lectures." Pride flickered in her green eyes. "I can set bones, perform surgery, deliver babies. It's all I ever wanted to do. Heal people." Thomas made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Instead of offering to take her to town where she'd be safe but discovered, he looked toward the hidden canyon where his people waited, the people whose existence he'd kept secret for 5 years. "Miss Whitehorse," he said quietly, I know a place where healing happens without questions asked. The ride through Devil's Canyon took 2 hours, following ancient Apache trails that wound between towering red rock formations. Thomas led his paint horse carefully through the narrow passages, Rebecca seated behind him, her arms wrapped around his waist for support. She'd grown quiet after accepting his offer of sanctuary, though he could feel the tension in her body every time distant hoofbeats echoed off the canyon walls. "They're following us," she whispered against his shoulder. Thomas nodded grimly. "Dr. Ashworth's got tracking dogs and men who know this territory, but they don't know the hidden paths." He guided his horse down a steep slope that seemed to lead nowhere, then through a crack in the rock face so narrow they had to dismount and lead the animal through. "My grandfather showed me these trails when I was young." On the other side lay a hidden valley that took Rebecca's breath away. Wickiups and traditional Apache dwellings dotted the canyon floor, smoke rising from cooking fires. Children played between the shelters while women worked with pottery and weaving. Men tended horses in natural corrals formed by the rock walls. It was a living, breathing Apache community that existed completely outside the government's knowledge. "Thomas," Rebecca breathed, "what is this place?" "Home," he said simply, then louder called out in Apache to announce their arrival. An elderly man emerged from the largest dwelling, his long gray braids adorned with eagle feathers, his weathered face marked by wisdom and years of leadership. Chief Joseph Running Bear moved with the dignity of a born leader, though Thomas could see the slight tremor in his hands that spoke of advancing illness. The chief's eyes fixed on Rebecca with an intensity that made her step closer to Thomas. When Joseph spoke, his voice carried the weight of prophecy. "She has returned to us as the dreams foretold." "Grandfather," Thomas said in English for Rebecca's benefit, "this is Rebecca Whitehorse. She's injured and needs sanctuary." But the chief was already approaching Rebecca, his ancient eyes studying her face with growing amazement. When his gaze fell on the prayer beads around her neck, he stopped breathing. "Child," he whispered, reaching out with a shaking hand to touch the leather pouch. "Where did you get these?" Rebecca's fingers protectively covered the beads. "They were my mother's. She died when I was 8, and the family that raised me said they were Irish prayer beads." Joseph's knees nearly buckled. Thomas caught his grandfather's arm, alarmed by the sudden pallor in the old man's face. "What is it?" "These are not Irish beads," Joseph said, his voice thick with emotion. "These belong to my daughter, Evening Star. She left the tribe 20 years ago to marry a white doctor, against my wishes. The night she left, she took these beads, blessed by 4 generations of medicine women." Rebecca stared at the chief, then at the beads, her world tilting on its axis. "That's impossible. My mother was Irish, Margaret O'Brien from Boston." "Your mother took a white name to protect you," Joseph said gently. "But her Apache name was Evening Star, and she was my only daughter. You are my granddaughter, returned to us in our darkest hour." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Everything she'd believed about her identity, her heritage, her very sense of self, crumbled in an instant. "No," she whispered, backing away. "You're mistaken. I'm white. I was raised in Boston society. I don't even speak Apache." But even as she protested, memories surfaced, dreams filled with desert landscapes, an inexplicable comfort with traditional medicines, the way certain Apache words felt familiar on her tongue. Thomas watched her struggle with the revelation, his heart aching for her confusion. "The spirits brought you home," Joseph continued. "Our people are dying from a sickness that white medicine cannot cure. Children waste away despite all our healers' efforts. We have prayed for a bridge between the old ways and the new." As if summoned by his words, a young Apache woman rushed toward them, her face streaked with tears. "Chief Running Bear," she cried, "Blue Flower's baby comes too early. The birth is wrong. The child is turned around. Our midwives cannot save them both. Rebecca's medical training kicked in automatically. Breech presentation, she murmured, then looked up to meet Joseph's knowing gaze. How far along is she? The baby has been trying to come since yesterday's dawn, the woman replied. Blue flower grows weak. Rebecca looked between Thomas and the chief, her internal struggle visible on her face. Accept this impossible truth about her heritage or walk away from people who desperately needed her skills. The prayer beads seemed to warm against her skin, and for a moment she could swear she heard her mother's voice, whispering in a language she shouldn't understand, but somehow did. Take me to her, Rebecca said firmly, shouldering her medical bag. And someone find me hot water, clean cloths, and whatever surgical instruments you have. As they hurried toward the dwelling where Blue Flower labored, Thomas felt pride swell in his chest. Granddaughter of Chief Joseph Running Bear or not, Rebecca Whitehorse was exactly the healer their people needed. The birthing lodge filled with tension as Rebecca knelt beside Blue Flower, whose exhausted face glistened with sweat in the flickering firelight. The young Apache woman, barely 20, had been laboring for over 30 hours, and Rebecca could see the dangerous signs: pale lips, rapid, shallow breathing, and the telltale positioning that meant the baby was coming feet first. "Has anyone checked the baby's position?" Rebecca asked, washing her hands in the basin of hot water the midwives had prepared. The eldest midwife, a woman named Gray Dove, nodded gravely. "The little one is stubborn, like his father. He comes backwards into this world." Rebecca gently examined Blue Flower, confirming her fears. The baby was in complete breech presentation, and from the mother's weakening condition, they had perhaps an hour before they lost them both. She looked up to find Thomas crouched beside her, his face etched with concern. "I need to try to turn the baby," Rebecca said quietly. "It's dangerous, but if we don't act now—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. Thomas translated for the gathered women, and Rebecca watched their faces carefully. These midwives had delivered hundreds of babies using traditional methods passed down through generations. Asking them to trust a stranger, especially one who claimed to be Apache but had been raised white, was asking for a leap of faith that could cost 2 lives. Gray Dove spoke in rapid Apache, her weathered hands gesturing expressively. Thomas translated. "She says Evening Star's daughter carries the healing gift in her blood. If you can save Blue Flower and her child, the spirits have truly sent you home." Blue Flower reached up and grasped Rebecca's hand, her grip surprisingly strong despite her exhaustion. "Please," she whispered in English, "save my baby." Rebecca nodded, her training taking over. "I need clean cloths, more hot water, and everyone except Thomas and Gray Dove to step outside. This requires concentration and quiet." As the lodge emptied, Rebecca began the delicate process of external cephalic version, using her hands to carefully manipulate the baby through the mother's abdomen, attempting to coax it into the proper head-down position. It was a procedure she'd only read about in medical journals, never attempted herself. Thomas held Blue Flower's hand and spoke to her in soothing Apache, his voice steady and calming. Rebecca was amazed by his knowledge of childbirth procedures. He anticipated her needs, handing her instruments and supplies without being asked. "You've done this before," she observed, pausing to let Blue Flower rest between contractions. "My people don't have the luxury of specialists," Thomas replied. "When someone's hurt or sick, you help however you can. I've assisted at births, set bones, even removed bullets. Where did you learn surgical techniques?" Thomas's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Carlisle Indian Industrial School." "They trained some of us in basic medical care, said it would make us useful in white society." The bitterness in his voice made Rebecca look up sharply, but before she could ask more questions, Blue Flower cried out as another contraction hit. Rebecca felt carefully along the woman's abdomen, her heart leaping as she detected movement. "The baby's turning," she announced, unable to keep the excitement from her voice. "Gray Dove, feel here. Do you sense the change?" The elderly midwife placed her experienced hands beside Rebecca's and nodded slowly, a smile breaking across her weathered face. She spoke rapidly in Apache, and Thomas grinned. "She says the spirits are working through your hands," he translated. "The little warrior has decided to enter the world properly." What followed was the most intense hour of Rebecca's medical career. Working by firelight, with traditional Apache songs humming softly in the background, she guided Blue Flower through the final stages of labor. The baby's head crowned just as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, and with one final push, a healthy baby boy entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the canyon. "A son," Gray Dove announced in English, tears streaming down her face as she lifted the squalling infant. "A perfect, strong son." Blue Flower wept as she held her baby for the first time, speaking to him in rapid Apache while he rooted instinctively for his first meal. Rebecca sat back on her heels, exhausted but exhilarated. She had saved 2 lives using techniques that bridged traditional and modern medicine, proving that healing knew no cultural boundaries. Chief Joseph Running Bear entered the lodge as Rebecca was cleaning up, his ancient eyes bright with unshed tears. "My granddaughter," he said softly, "you have given our people a great gift. This child will grow up knowing that Evening Star's daughter returned to save his life." Rebecca felt tears pricking her own eyes. "I only did what any trained medical person would do." "No," Joseph said firmly. "You did what family does. You came home." As they prepared to leave the birthing lodge, Thomas caught Rebecca's arm gently. "There's something you should know," he said quietly. Blue Flower's husband was one of the children taken to Carlisle School. He escaped 2 years ago, but the experience broke something in him. This baby represents hope, proof that our people can survive and thrive despite everything that's been done to us. Rebecca studied Thomas's face, seeing pain there that went deeper than personal experience. "You were at Carlisle, too." "For 4 years, from age 12 to 16. His voice was barely above a whisper. "They said they were killing the Indian to save the man. What they really did was tear children away from everything they knew and try to erase their souls." "Thomas." "My real name is Thomas Running Wolf," he continued. "I'm Chief Joseph's adopted son, not his grandson. My birth parents were killed in a cavalry raid when I was 8. The white family that took me in after Carlisle tried to give me a good life, but I never forgot who I really was." Rebecca felt the final pieces of understanding click into place. "That's why you have money, but live like this, moving between 2 worlds." "I use my white man's wealth to help my people survive," Thomas confirmed. "Railroad investments, cattle deals, mining rights. I play their game to protect what's left of ours." The sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation, and Thomas's face went pale. "They've found us." The thundering of hooves echoed through Devil's Canyon as a dozen mounted men appeared at the Hidden Valley's entrance. Dr. Marcus Ashworth rode at their head, his pale face twisted with determination and something darker: obsession. Behind him came federal marshals, local deputies, and 2 men Rebecca didn't recognize, but whose cold eyes and expensive clothes screamed government authority. Thomas immediately stepped in front of Rebecca, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt .45 at his hip. Around the village, Apache warriors melted into defensive positions behind rocks and dwellings, their presence barely visible but unmistakably lethal. "Dr. Ashworth," Thomas called out, his voice carrying across the canyon with deceptive calm. "You're trespassing on private land." Ashworth dismounted, his movements sharp and agitated. "Mr. Sterling, I presume? I'm here on federal business." "Miss Whitehorse is mentally unstable and requires immediate medical attention." His eyes found Rebecca behind Thomas, and his expression softened into what he probably thought was compassionate concern. "Rebecca, my dear, your father is worried sick. Come with me now, and we'll forget this unfortunate episode." "I'm not going anywhere with you," Rebecca replied firmly, stepping out from behind Thomas despite his protective gesture. "I know what you really want from me." "What I want is to help you recover from your obvious breakdown," Ashworth said smoothly. "Running away from a beneficial marriage, hiding with savages. These are clearly the actions of someone not in her right mind." Chief Joseph Running Bear emerged from his dwelling, moving with the quiet dignity that commanded respect even from enemies. The federal agents shifted uncomfortably as the old chief approached, clearly recognizing his authority despite his lack of official government status. "Dr. Ashworth," Joseph said in perfect English, "you are not welcome here. This woman came to us seeking sanctuary, which we have provided according to our ancient laws of hospitality." "The United States government doesn't recognize your ancient laws," one of the federal agents snapped. "This is an illegal settlement on territory designated for railroad development. You're all trespassing." Thomas felt his blood turn to ice. The railroad development, his own investments, had helped fund the survey that identified this land for seizure. The irony wasn't lost on him that his wealth, earned to protect his people, might have contributed to their downfall. "There's been no official relocation order issued for this area," Thomas said carefully, though he knew it was probably a matter of days or weeks. "Actually, there has been," Ashworth said with a satisfied smile. He pulled a document from his jacket. "Executive Order 847, signed yesterday by the territorial governor. All Native Americans in this region are to be relocated to the San Carlos Reservation within 30 days for their own protection and the advancement of civilized development." Rebecca felt sick. San Carlos was a death trap, a barren piece of desert where different tribes had been forced together with inadequate food, water, or medical care. Families died of starvation and disease while corrupt agents sold their supplies for personal profit. "Protection from what?" she demanded. Ashworth's smile widened, revealing too many teeth. "From the epidemic, of course. We've had reports of a strange illness affecting native populations throughout the territory. Symptoms include fever, respiratory distress, and rapid deterioration. Very concerning from a public health standpoint." Thomas and Rebecca exchanged glances. Neither had heard of any epidemic, and the timing was suspiciously convenient. "What kind of illness?" Rebecca asked, her medical training kicking in despite her distrust of the source. "That's classified medical information," one of the government agents interrupted. "Dr. Ashworth is here in his capacity as Territorial Medical Officer to assess the health situation and ensure proper treatment." "I'll need to examine all the children," Ashworth announced, dismounting and reaching for his medical bag. "Standard government protocol for disease prevention." "No." The word came from Thomas with such finality that several men reached for their weapons. "No one examines our children without permission from their families." "I'm afraid you don't have a choice in the matter," Ashworth said, his facade of reasonableness slipping. "Federal law supersedes your tribal customs. Any interference with a government health investigation is considered obstruction of justice." Rebecca stepped forward, her mind racing. "Dr. Ashworth, as a fellow medical professional, surely you understand the importance of informed consent and proper examination protocols. Perhaps we could discuss the specific symptoms you're investigating?" Ashworth's eyes narrowed as he studied her face. Miss Whitehorse, your medical credentials are hardly relevant to this situation. You're an unmarried woman who has clearly suffered a mental breakdown. Your judgment cannot be trusted. My judgment is perfectly sound, Rebecca replied coldly. Sound enough to recognize that this supposed epidemic is remarkably convenient for your relocation orders. Are you questioning the professional assessment of a licensed physician? Ashworth's voice rose dangerously. I'm questioning the motives of a man who would drag federal agents and armed marshals to treat sick children, Rebecca shot back. Real doctors don't need armies. The tension in the canyon stretched taut as both sides realized they were past the point of peaceful resolution. Chief Joseph placed a weathered hand on Rebecca's shoulder, his touch both protective and warning. Dr. Ashworth, the old chief said quietly, you may examine our children if you wish, but you will do so with their families present and with our own healers observing. We have nothing to hide. Rebecca stared at Joseph in shock. What was he doing? But the chief caught her eye and nodded almost imperceptibly. He had a plan. Very well, Ashworth agreed, though his expression suggested he'd expected more resistance. We'll start with the youngest. Bring them to me one by one. As the Apache families began gathering their children, Rebecca noticed Gray Dove and the other medicine women moving through the crowd, speaking in hushed tones to the mothers. Whatever Joseph had planned, the entire community was part of it. The first child brought forward was a boy of perhaps 6 years, his dark eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear. His mother, a young woman named Dawn Singer, held him close as Ashworth began his examination. Rebecca watched carefully as the doctor checked the boy's throat, listened to his chest, and examined his skin. Everything appeared routine until Ashworth reached into his bag for what looked like a vaccination needle. What are you giving him? Rebecca demanded. Preventive medicine, Ashworth replied without looking up. A new treatment to boost immunity against the epidemic. What kind of treatment? Rebecca pressed. What's the active ingredient? That's proprietary medical information, one of the federal agents said sharply. Dr. Ashworth doesn't need to justify his medical decisions to someone with questionable credentials. But Rebecca had seen enough. The way Ashworth handled the syringe, the nervous glances between the government agents, the complete lack of proper medical protocols, this wasn't treatment. This was something else entirely. Stop, she said loudly, stepping forward. Don't give that child anything until you explain exactly what it is. Stand back, Miss Whitehorse, Ashworth warned, the needle poised above the boy's arm. Interference with federal medical procedures is a criminal offense. So is administering unknown substances to children without proper consent or medical justification, Rebecca countered. I may not be a licensed physician, but I know medical law. Thomas moved to support her, his hand resting openly on his gun butt now. Around the canyon, the Apache warriors shifted position, ready for violence but waiting for their chief's signal. You're making a serious mistake, Ashworth said, his composure finally cracking. This woman is clearly delusional. She's infected you all with her paranoid fantasies. The only mistake here is yours, Chief Joseph said with quiet authority. You have revealed your true nature, Dr. Ashworth. This is not about disease prevention. This is about something far darker. You have no idea what you're interfering with, Ashworth snarled, dropping his medical facade entirely. There are forces at work here beyond your primitive understanding. The future of this territory, of this entire nation, depends on progress, on the advancement of civilization over savagery. Rebecca felt pieces clicking together in her mind. The convenient epidemic, the forced relocations, the mysterious injections. You're not preventing disease, she said with growing horror. You're causing it. That's a very serious accusation, one of the federal agents said, though his tone suggested nervousness rather than outrage. It's also true, Thomas said grimly. I've heard rumors from other reservations. Children getting sick after government medical visits, families dying of mysterious illnesses that only affect native populations. Ashworth laughed, a sound devoid of humor or humanity. You people are so suspicious, always assuming the worst of those trying to help you adapt to the modern world. Help us adapt or help us die, Rebecca demanded. Sometimes, Ashworth said quietly, they're the same thing. The words hung in the canyon air like a death sentence. Even some of the federal agents looked uncomfortable now, realizing they might be part of something far worse than a simple relocation order. Chief Joseph stepped forward, his ancient eyes blazing with righteous anger. You will leave our canyon now, Dr. Ashworth, you and all who came with you, and you will not return. I'm afraid that's not possible, Ashworth replied, signaling to his men. This settlement is illegal. These people are trespassing, and this woman, he pointed at Rebecca, is a fugitive from lawful custody. We're not leaving without them. Then you're not leaving at all, Thomas said quietly. And suddenly the canyon erupted with Apache warriors rising from concealment. Rifles appeared from behind rocks, arrows were knocked to bowstrings, and the government agents found themselves outnumbered 3-1 by invisible enemies who had materialized from the landscape itself. Mr. Sterling, one of the marshals said nervously, this is rebellion against federal authority. You're making yourself an enemy of the United States government. I've been an enemy of the United States government since the day I was born Apache, Thomas replied. The only difference now is that I'm finally admitting it. Rebecca looked around at the faces of the people she was only beginning to know, Blue Flower clutching her newborn son, Gray Dove standing protectively beside the children, Chief Joseph radiating dignity even in the face of overwhelming government power. These weren't savages or obstacles to progress. They were families trying to survive, healers trying to preserve ancient wisdom, elders trying to protect the future of their people. Dr. Ashworth, she said clearly, her voice carrying to every person in the canyon, I hereby formally refuse your medical treatment and your custody. I choose to remain here with my grandfather's people. Your grandfather? Ashworth's face went white. What are you talking about? Chief Joseph stepped beside Rebecca, placing his hand on her shoulder with unmistakable paternal pride. Doctor. Ashworth, meet my granddaughter, Rebecca Running Bear Whitehorse, daughter of Evening Star and granddaughter of 4 generations of Apache medicine women. She has come home to heal her people. The revelation hit the government agents like a physical blow. Not only was Rebecca not a simple runaway white woman, she was Apache royalty, the descendant of one of the most respected chief bloodlines in the territory. That's impossible, Ashworth whispered. She's white. She was raised in Boston society. I am both, Rebecca said firmly, and I choose to be Apache. The standoff stretched taut as both sides realized they had reached the point of no return. Rebecca's choice had transformed this from a simple custody dispute into a declaration of war between 2 cultures, 2 ways of life, 2 visions of what the American West should become. And in that moment, as she stood between Thomas and her grandfather with the Apache warriors at her back, Rebecca Whitehorse finally understood who she truly was and what she was willing to fight for. The standoff shattered when Dr. Ashworth made a desperate grab for his medical bag, his hand closing around what looked like a small glass vial. If you won't submit to proper treatment, he snarled at Rebecca, then you'll face the consequences of your primitive choices. Thomas saw the movement and reacted instantly, his Colt .45 clearing leather in one smooth motion. Drop it, Ashworth! But the doctor was already hurling the vial toward the group of Apache children huddled near their mothers. The glass container arced through the morning air, catching sunlight like a deadly star, before shattering against the canyon wall just feet from little Joseph Running Bear's newest grandson. Everyone back! Rebecca shouted, her medical training recognizing the danger even without knowing the specifics. "Don't breathe near that area. Cover your faces." The canyon erupted into chaos. Apache warriors surged forward while federal agents drew their weapons, caught between their orders and their growing realization that they were part of something monstrous. Children screamed as their mothers pulled them away from the shattered glass and whatever substance had been inside. Chief Joseph Running Bear's voice cut through the pandemonium like a war cry. "This is how your government keeps its promises. This is their idea of medical treatment." Dr. Ashworth backed toward his horse, his face twisted with fanatical determination. "You don't understand the bigger picture," he shouted over the chaos. "These people are a dying race. We're simply hastening the inevitable for the good of civilization." "The only thing dying here is your humanity," Rebecca replied, kneeling beside a young girl who had fallen in the panic. The child was crying but uninjured, and Rebecca gathered her close protectively. Thomas kept his gun trained on Ashworth while scanning the other government agents. Some looked genuinely horrified by what they'd witnessed, while others seemed prepared to fight their way out. "Marshal Henderson," he called to the senior federal officer, "you swore an oath to protect innocent people. Look around you. Do these children look like enemies of the state?" Marshal Henderson, a graying man in his 50s, slowly holstered his weapon. "Dr. Ashworth, what exactly was in that vial?" "Preventive medicine," Ashworth replied quickly, but sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. "A new vaccination protocol approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs." "Vaccinations don't come in glass vials that you throw at people," Rebecca said sharply, standing with the little girl still in her arms. "And they certainly don't require armed escorts and relocation orders." One of the younger federal agents, barely out of his teens, lowered his rifle completely. "Sir, this doesn't feel right. These people aren't threatening anyone. They're just trying to protect their families." "Agent Morrison, you're out of line," Henderson snapped, but his own conviction seemed to be wavering. Chief Joseph stepped forward, his weathered hands empty but his presence commanding absolute attention. "Dr. Ashworth," he said with deadly calm, "you have attacked children under my protection. In Apache law, that is an act of war." "Your Apache law means nothing," Ashworth retorted, but his voice cracked slightly. "This entire settlement is illegal. You're all squatters on government land, designated for railroad development." Thomas felt his heart sink as he realized the full scope of what they were facing. "The railroad development," he said slowly. "Whose survey teams marked this land?" "Sterling Pacific Railway Consortium," one of the agents replied automatically, then looked confused. "Wait, isn't your name Sterling?" The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Thomas's own investments, made through intermediaries to hide his Apache identity, had funded the survey that marked this sacred canyon for destruction. His wealth, earned to protect his people, had been turned into a weapon against them. "My God," Rebecca whispered, seeing the revelation in Thomas's face. "You didn't know." "I thought I was investing in legitimate railroad expansion," Thomas said bitterly. "I never imagined they'd target this specific area." "Oh, but they did," Ashworth said with malicious satisfaction. "In fact, Mr. Running Wolf, or should I say Mr. Sterling, your financial backing made the entire operation possible. Poetic justice, really, using Indian money to buy Indian land." The cruelty of it hit Thomas like a physical blow. Every dollar he'd earned, every investment he'd made, every business deal he'd struck to gain the resources to help his people, all of it had been manipulated into a trap that would destroy them. "Thomas," Rebecca said urgently, moving to his side, "this isn't your fault. You couldn't have known." "Couldn't I?" Thomas's voice was hollow with self-recrimination. "I played their game, used their methods, thought I could beat them at their own rules. All I did was give them the rope to hang us with." Chief Joseph placed a weathered hand on his adopted son's shoulder. "The coyote who thinks he can outwit the eagle often forgets that he cannot fly. but wisdom comes from learning, not from never making mistakes. Dr. Ashworth was backing steadily toward his horse now, his eyes darting between the armed Apache warriors and his increasingly reluctant federal escorts. "This changes nothing," he declared. "The relocation order stands. This land has been purchased legally, and these people will be moved to San Carlos within 30 days. "And if they refuse?" Marshal Henderson asked quietly. "Then they'll face the full consequences of resisting federal authority," Ashworth replied. "The Army has dealt with Apache resistance before." The threat hung in the canyon air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Everyone present understood what Army intervention meant, the systematic destruction of Native American communities that had characterized westward expansion for decades. Rebecca felt rage building in her chest, a fury she'd never experienced in her sheltered Boston upbringing. "Dr. Ashworth," she said, her voice deadly quiet, "you're talking about genocide." "I'm talking about progress," Ashworth corrected. "The inevitable march of civilization over savagery. These people can adapt to modern life on the reservations, or they can face the consequences of their stubborn primitivism." "And the children?" Rebecca pressed. "What about the children who would die from whatever poison you were planning to inject them with?" "Sacrifices for the greater good," Ashworth said dismissively. "A few primitive children weighed against the future prosperity of an entire territory. The mathematics are quite simple." The casual way he discussed murdering children finally broke something in Thomas. With a roar of pure Apache fury, he launched himself at the doctor, tackling him to the ground before anyone could react. The two men rolled in the dirt, Thomas's fists finding their target repeatedly while Ashworth screamed for help. "Thomas, stop!" Rebecca shouted, but she understood his rage even as she feared for his safety. Marshal Henderson and his agents moved to intervene but found themselves facing a wall of Apache warriors who had materialized around the fighting men. The message was clear. This was tribal justice being dispensed, and outsiders would not interfere. Chief Joseph raised one hand, and instantly Thomas stopped his assault, though he remained crouched over the bleeding doctor like a predator over prey. "Dr. Ashworth," the chief said with ceremonial formality, "you have threatened our children, poisoned our land, and brought war to our peaceful canyon. By Apache law, your life is forfeit." "You can't kill a federal officer," Ashworth gasped through split lips. "It would bring the entire army down on your heads." "Perhaps," Joseph agreed, "but you would still be dead." The simple truth of it silenced the canyon. Everyone understood that they had crossed into territory where federal law and tribal justice existed in deadly opposition, where any choice would have consequences that rippled far beyond this hidden valley. Rebecca stepped forward, her mind racing through possibilities. "There's another way," she said quietly. "Dr. Ashworth, you're going to return to your superiors and report that this settlement has been evacuated voluntarily." "Why would I do that?" Ashworth demanded. "Because," Rebecca replied, reaching into her medical bag and withdrawing a small notebook, "I've been documenting everything you've said and done here today. Every threat, every mention of poison, every casual reference to murdering children. My notes will make fascinating reading for newspaper reporters and congressional investigators." Ashworth's face went white. "You're bluffing." Rebecca read from her notes. "Dr. Marcus Ashworth, Territorial Medical Officer, quote, "A few primitive children weighed against the future prosperity of an entire territory. The mathematics are quite simple." End quote. Witnessed by federal agents and recorded for posterity. Marshal Henderson stared at the doctor with growing horror. "Ashworth, please tell me she's misquoting you." "It's taken out of context," Ashworth protested weakly. "What context makes discussing the murder of children acceptable?" Rebecca demanded. What context justifies throwing poison at families? The federal agents were looking at each other now, realizing they had been party to something that went far beyond their understanding or authority. Young Agent Morrison spoke up hesitantly. "Sir, maybe we should return to headquarters and request clarification of our orders." "Our orders are clear," Ashworth snapped, but his authority was crumbling. "These people are to be relocated by force if necessary." "Our orders were to assist with a medical evaluation," Henderson corrected grimly. "Nothing in my briefing mentioned poison or threats against children." Thomas stood slowly, his knuckles bloody but his eyes burning with righteous fury. "Marshal Henderson, I'm asking you to make a choice. You can follow this madman's orders and be part of something history will condemn, or you can remember why you became a lawman in the first place." Henderson looked around the canyon, at the children clinging to their mothers, at the warriors prepared to die defending their families, at Chief Joseph's dignified bearing in the face of overwhelming government power. When his eyes met Rebecca's, he saw not a fugitive or a savage, but a woman whose courage had exposed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. "Dr. Ashworth," Henderson said finally, "I'm placing you under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit assault and for conduct unbecoming a government officer." "You can't arrest me," Ashworth shrieked. "I have authority from Washington. This operation has been approved at the highest levels." "Then those people in Washington are going to have some very uncomfortable questions to answer," Henderson replied, signaling to his men to secure the doctor. As federal agents moved to restrain Ashworth, the doctor's facade of civilized authority finally collapsed completely. "You're all making a terrible mistake," he screamed. "These people are doomed. Their way of life is finished. I was offering them mercy, a quick death instead of slow starvation on the reservations." The words echoed off the canyon walls like a confession of genocide, heard by everyone present and witnessed by federal agents who would be compelled to testify about what they had seen and heard. Rebecca watched Dr. Ashworth being led away in chains, but she felt no satisfaction in his downfall. The conspiracy he represented was larger than one madman's obsession. It was systemic, institutional, and deeply rooted in the American government's approach to Native peoples. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger war was just beginning. 3 days after Dr. Ashworth's arrest, the canyon that had seemed like a sanctuary became a trap. Thomas stood on the rim overlooking their hidden valley, watching through his spyglass as cavalry units positioned themselves at every known entrance and exit. 2 full companies of the 7th Cavalry had arrived from Fort Apache, along with artillery pieces that could turn their peaceful settlement into a crater. "They're not here to negotiate," he told Chief Joseph grimly as they surveyed the military encampment spreading across the desert floor. "Colonel Morrison has orders to clear this canyon by any means necessary." The old chief's weathered face remained impassive, but Thomas could see the weight of responsibility crushing down on his shoulders. 63 Apache families called this hidden valley home, men, women, children, and elders who had found refuge here from the brutal conditions of government reservations. "How long before they attack?" Joseph asked quietly. "Marshal Henderson is trying to buy us time, but his authority only goes so far. Word came down from the territorial capital this morning. We're to be treated as hostile combatants unless we surrender unconditionally within 24 hours. Rebecca emerged from the birthing lodge where she'd been tending to Blue Flower and her newborn son. Her face was drawn with exhaustion and something deeper, the crushing realization that her medical skills couldn't heal the larger wounds inflicted by government policy. "How many casualties can we expect if they attack?" she asked Thomas, her nurse's training forcing her to think practically even in the face of approaching catastrophe. Thomas exchanged a look with his grandfather. "Rebecca, they're not planning to take prisoners. The orders specify complete pacification of hostile elements. In military terms, that means they're going to kill everyone," Rebecca finished, her voice barely above a whisper. The three of them stood in silence, watching smoke rise from cooking fires throughout the village below. Children played between the wickiups while their mothers prepared the evening meal, unaware that this might be their last night alive. The normalcy of the scene made the approaching violence even more obscene. "There has to be another way," Rebecca said desperately. "Some legal recourse, some authority higher than Colonel Morrison." "The territorial governor signed the extermination order personally," Thomas replied bitterly. "Dr. Ashworth's arrest has been portrayed as an Apache attack on federal officers. They're using it to justify what they've wanted to do all along." Chief Joseph placed a gentle hand on Rebecca's shoulder. "Granddaughter, you have given our people a precious gift. You showed them that healing was possible, that the two worlds could work together. That gift doesn't disappear even if our bodies do." "I won't accept that," Rebecca said fiercely. "There has to be something we can do." "There is," Thomas said quietly, and both Rebecca and Joseph turned to stare at him. "I can give them what they really want." "What do you mean?" Rebecca asked, though she was already afraid of the answer. "They want the land for railroad development. My railroad development, funded with my money." Thomas's voice was heavy with self-recrimination. "If I surrender myself and sign over the mineral and water rights, they might let the families go." "Thomas, no," Rebecca said immediately. "They'll hang you as a traitor." "Better one death than 63 families massacred," Thomas replied. "It's the only bargaining chip we have." Chief Joseph studied his adopted son's face for a long moment. "You would sacrifice yourself for people who never fully accepted you as Apache?" "These are my people," Thomas said simply. "The color of my skin doesn't change that." "My heart beats Apache. My dreams speak Apache. And if I die Apache." Rebecca felt tears streaming down her face. In the space of a week, she had discovered her true heritage, found love, and now faced losing everything again. "There has to be another way," she repeated desperately. "Maybe there is," said a new voice behind them. They turned to see Marshal Henderson climbing the rocky path to their lookout point, his face grim but determined. Behind him came Agent Morrison, the young federal officer who had questioned the morality of their mission from the beginning. "Marshal," Thomas said warily, his hand moving instinctively toward his weapon, "I thought you'd return to Tucson." "I did. And what I found there changed everything." Henderson held up a telegram. "This came through military channels an hour ago. Dr. Ashworth has been talking, trying to save his own neck by implicating his superiors." Rebecca moved closer. "What did he say?" "Enough to bring down half the territorial government," Agent Morrison replied, his young face flushed with excitement. "The medical experiments, the poisoned supplies sent to reservations, the deliberate introduction of diseases, it goes all the way to Washington." Henderson nodded grimly. "Turns out Dr. Ashworth was keeping detailed records of everything, including financial transactions and correspondence with federal officials. He's been operating under direct orders from the Bureau of Indian Affairs." "That doesn't change our immediate situation," Thomas pointed out. "There are still 2 companies of cavalry preparing to attack at dawn." "Actually, it does," Henderson said, producing another document. "This is a federal court injunction signed by Judge William Parker in Santa Fe. All military action against this settlement is suspended pending a full congressional investigation into illegal government activities targeting Native American populations." Thomas stared at the legal document, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "How did you get a federal judge to act so quickly?" "Turns out Judge Parker's own grandson died of mysterious circumstances while attending Carlisle School," Agent Morrison explained. "When we showed him Dr. Ashworth's confession about medical experiments on Native children, he moved heaven and earth to stop what's happening here." Rebecca felt a surge of hope, but years of disappointment had taught her caution. "What about Colonel Morrison and his cavalry units? Will they honor a civilian court order?" Henderson's expression darkened. That's where things get complicated. The colonel claims he's operating under military authority that supersedes civilian courts. He's demanding proof that his orders have been officially countermanded by the War Department. And, Chief Joseph asked quietly. And telegraphs to Washington take time, Henderson admitted. I've sent messages to every authority I can think of, but bureaucracy moves slowly even in crisis situations. Thomas felt the temporary hope deflating. So we're back where we started. The cavalry attacks at dawn unless we surrender. Not necessarily, Rebecca said suddenly, her mind racing. Marshal Henderson, you said Dr. Ashworth has been talking to save himself. What if we could get him here? Let him tell Colonel Morrison directly about the illegal orders and false intelligence. Rebecca, that man tried to poison children, Thomas protested. We can't trust anything he says. We don't have to trust him, Rebecca replied. But if he's already confessing to federal authorities, maybe he'd be willing to tell the truth to save his own life. Especially if the alternative is being hanged for treason. Henderson considered this. It might work. Ashworth is desperate enough to try anything, and if he can convince the colonel that this entire operation was based on fabricated intelligence, the cavalry might withdraw without a fight, Agent Morrison finished. It's worth trying. Chief Joseph had been listening to this exchange with the patience of age and wisdom. Now he spoke up quietly. There is something else to consider. Win or lose, the secret of this canyon is lost forever. Too many people know of our existence now. Even if we survive this crisis, we cannot remain hidden. The truth of his words settled over them like a funeral shroud. Regardless of what happened with the cavalry, the Apache families in Devil's Canyon would have to find a new way to live, a new place to call home. Then we make sure they survive to find that new place, Rebecca said firmly. Whatever it takes. Thomas looked at the woman he had come to love, standing proud and determined in the face of impossible odds. Whatever it takes, he agreed. As the sun set over Devil's Canyon, painting the red rocks in shades of fire and blood, 4 people who had never expected to be allies prepared to gamble everything on one desperate plan to save innocent lives from the machinery of government indifference. The confrontation with Dr. Ashworth took place at dawn in the center of Devil's Canyon, with Colonel Morrison's cavalry positioned on the rim above like vultures waiting for death. Thomas stood beside Rebecca and Chief Joseph, watching as Marshal Henderson escorted the shackled doctor down the narrow trail into their hidden valley. Ashworth looked haggard and broken, his once pristine medical clothing now stained and wrinkled from 3 days in federal custody. But his eyes still held the fanatical gleam that had driven him to attempt genocide, and Rebecca felt her skin crawl as his gaze fixed on her with undisguised hatred. "Miss Whitehorse," he said with mock politeness, "how nice to see you again. I trust you've enjoyed your little adventure playing Indian?" "Dr. Ashworth," Rebecca replied coldly, "I trust you've enjoyed federal custody." "I hear treason charges carry the death penalty." Colonel Morrison, a stern-faced career soldier in his 50s, dismounted from his horse and surveyed the Apache settlement with obvious distaste. He had brought a small escort with him, including a military stenographer to record the proceedings, but the bulk of his forces remained positioned for attack. "Mr. Sterling," the colonel said to Thomas, "or should I say, Mr. Running Wolf, my orders are quite clear. This illegal settlement is to be disbanded and all occupants relocated to San Carlos Reservation. Dr. Ashworth's legal troubles don't change that fact." "Actually, Colonel, they do," Marshal Henderson interrupted, producing the federal court injunction again. "This document specifically prohibits military action against this community pending congressional investigation." Morrison barely glanced at the papers. "That civilian court has no authority over military operations conducted under War Department orders. I answer to my commanding general, not to some territorial judge." Chief Joseph stepped forward with the dignity that had made him a respected leader for 4 decades. Colonel Morrison, we request the right to speak in our own defense before you take action against innocent families. There's nothing to discuss, Morrison replied curtly. These people are trespassing on government land designated for railroad development. They have 20 minutes to gather essential belongings before evacuation begins. That's not entirely accurate, Thomas said quietly, pulling a leather portfolio from his jacket. This land was purchased legally through the Sterling Pacific Railway Consortium. These documents show clear title. Morrison examined the papers with growing confusion. If you own this land legally, why are you living here in hiding? Because, Rebecca said, stepping forward, someone has been using false medical emergencies and fabricated health crises to justify seizing Apache lands regardless of legal ownership. Dr. Ashworth, would you care to explain your role in that conspiracy? Ashworth's face went white as all eyes turned to him. I don't know what you're talking about. My medical assessments have been completely professional and based on legitimate health concerns. Really? Rebecca pulled out her medical notes from their first encounter. Then perhaps you can explain why you attempted to inject unknown substances into Apache children without their parents' consent or proper medical justification? I was providing preventive treatment against epidemic diseases, Ashworth said defensively, but sweat was beading on his forehead. Agent Morrison, the young federal officer, spoke up unexpectedly. Dr. Ashworth, that's not what you told federal investigators yesterday. According to your sworn statement, you were administering experimental compounds designed to test genetic resistance patterns in native populations. The words hung in the canyon air like an executioner's blade. Colonel Morrison stared at his medical advisor with growing horror, while the Apache families watching from a safe distance murmured among themselves in their native language. Agent Morrison, Ashworth said desperately, you're taking my statements out of context. The research was designed to help these people adapt to modern life, to boost their immunity against diseases they might encounter in civilized society. By deliberately exposing them to those diseases? Rebecca demanded. Your own notes, which I've seen copies of, describe introducing controlled pathogens to test traditional healing methods against modern medicine. Chief Joseph's voice cut through the mounting tension like a war cry. Colonel Morrison, this man has admitted to conducting medical experiments on our children. In any civilized nation, that would be considered a war crime. Morrison turned to face his medical officer, his career soldier's sense of honor warring with his ingrained prejudices. Dr. Ashworth, I need a straight answer. Have you been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on Native American populations? Nothing unauthorized, Ashworth protested. Everything I've done has been approved by the Bureau of Indian Affairs as part of the civilization program. We're trying to determine the most effective methods of transitioning these people from primitive lifestyles to productive citizenship. And if some of them died in the process? Thomas asked quietly. Sacrifices are necessary for progress, Ashworth replied, then immediately realized how his words sounded in front of a military tribunal. Colonel Morrison's face had gone stone cold. Doctor, are you telling me that my troops have been deployed to support medical experiments that resulted in the deaths of civilians, including children? Not civilians, Ashworth said desperately. Hostile Indians who refused to comply with government relocation orders. There's a difference under military law. Rebecca felt rage building in her chest at the casual dehumanization in Ashworth's words. Colonel Morrison, I'm a trained nurse. I've examined some of Dr. Ashworth's experimental subjects from other reservations, children who developed mysterious illnesses after receiving his preventive treatments, families who died of diseases that perfectly healthy people shouldn't contract. That's circumstantial evidence, Ashworth protested. Correlation doesn't prove causation. These people have primitive immune systems and poor hygiene practices. Dr. Ashworth? Agent Morrison interrupted, pulling out a transcript. Yesterday you confessed to introducing controlled amounts of typhoid bacteria into reservation water supplies to test the effectiveness of traditional Apache healing methods. Are you now recanting that confession? The words hit the assembled group like a physical blow. Even Colonel Morrison, hardened by decades of frontier warfare, looked sick at the implications. I never said typhoid, Ashworth said weakly. That's a mischaracterization of my research methodology. Actually, Marshal Henderson said, producing yet another document, that's a direct quote from your signed confession. Introduced controlled pathogenic elements, including typhoid bacteria, to test immune response and traditional healing efficacy in native populations. Your signature is on every page. Thomas felt the world tilting around him as the full scope of the government's war against his people became clear. Not just cultural genocide through forced assimilation, but actual biological warfare designed to eliminate Apache communities entirely. Colonel, Chief Joseph said with quiet dignity, now you understand why we live in hiding, not because we are criminals, but because our own government has declared war on our children. Morrison was staring at Dr. Ashworth with undisguised revulsion. Doctor, if what these people are saying is true, you've involved my command in war crimes. Do you understand the implications of that? I've involved your command in the advancement of civilization over savagery, Ashworth replied, his facade of reasonableness finally cracking completely. These people are a dying race anyway. I was simply hastening the inevitable while gathering valuable scientific data that could benefit humanity as a whole. Valuable scientific data? Rebecca stepped forward, her medical training warring with her human outrage. You murdered children for data? I advanced the understanding of racial immunity patterns and cultural adaptation mechanisms, Ashworth corrected coldly. The individual losses were regrettable but necessary for the greater scientific good. The clinical detachment in his voice finally broke something in Thomas. With a roar of pure Apache fury, he lunged at the doctor, but Colonel Morrison's soldiers restrained him before he could reach his target. Thomas, no! Rebecca shouted, but she understood his rage. She was struggling with her own desire to strangle the man who spoke of murdering children as if he were discussing laboratory mice. Colonel Morrison looked around the canyon, at the Apache families huddled protectively around their children, at the medicine women who had spent generations healing their people with traditional remedies, at Chief Joseph's dignified bearing in the face of systematic persecution. Dr. Ashworth, the colonel said finally, his voice heavy with disgust, you're relieved of your position as medical advisor to this command. Agent Morrison, place him under military arrest pending court-martial for conduct unbecoming an officer and conspiracy to commit war crimes. You can't do this to me, Ashworth screamed as federal agents moved to secure him. I was following orders. This entire program was approved by Washington. They'll abandon you the moment this becomes public. Maybe they will, Morrison replied grimly. But I took an oath to defend innocent people, not to participate in their murder. As Dr. Ashworth was led away in chains, screaming threats and justifications that no one wanted to hear, Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and exhaustion. The immediate crisis had passed, but the larger implications of what they'd learned were staggering. Colonel Morrison, Chief Joseph said quietly, what happens to our people now? Morrison looked uncomfortable. Officially, I still have orders to relocate this settlement, but given what we've just learned about the reasons behind those orders, I'm requesting clarification from my superiors before taking any action. And unofficially? Thomas asked. The colonel studied the Apache leader's weathered face, then looked at Rebecca and Thomas. Unofficially, I think you people have suffered enough at the hands of men like Dr. Ashworth. I'll do what I can to buy you time to find a legal solution. Rebecca felt tears of relief streaming down her face. They had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The conspiracy that Dr. Ashworth represented reached deep into the American government, and exposing it would require courage that she wasn't sure she possessed. But looking around at the faces of the people she had come to love, Thomas with his quiet strength, Chief Joseph with his unshakable dignity, Blue Flower with her newborn son, who represented hope for the future, Rebecca knew she would find that courage somehow. The truth about what had been done to the Apache people would come to light, no matter what it cost her personally. 2 years later, Rebecca Running Bear Sterling stood on the porch of the new Apache Medical Center, watching her twin sons play in the garden with their Apache and white playmates. Little Joseph, named for his great-grandfather, chased butterflies with the focused determination he'd inherited from his father, while Peace, true to his name, sat contentedly building elaborate structures from smooth river stones. The medical center had become a symbol of what was possible when two cultures worked together instead of against each other. Built with funds from Thomas's reorganized railroad investments and designed according to both modern medical principles and traditional Apache healing wisdom, it served patients from across the Arizona Territory, regardless of race or ability to pay. "Mrs. Sterling," called Dr. Sarah Whitman, the young physician from Harvard Medical School who had come west specifically to work with Rebecca after reading about her innovations in medical journals. "The afternoon patients are ready for you." Rebecca smiled, adjusting the leather pouch around her neck that still held her grandmother Evening Star's prayer beads. The combination of her Boston medical training and Apache healing traditions had created treatment methods that were being studied by doctors as far away as New York and San Francisco. "Thank you, Sarah. How is Mrs. Henderson doing?" "The marshal's wife is responding well to the herbal treatments you prescribed. Her rheumatism has improved dramatically since we added the traditional Apache remedies to her conventional medication." Rebecca nodded with satisfaction. Marshal Henderson had become one of their strongest allies after the revelations about Dr. Ashworth's medical experiments. His wife's successful treatment had convinced many skeptical white settlers that Apache healing wisdom deserved respect rather than dismissal. As Rebecca entered the medical center, she paused to read the bronze plaque beside the door. "Founded in memory of Chief Joseph Running Bear and all children who died in the name of false progress. True healing comes not from conquering nature, but from learning to work with it." Her grandfather had lived just long enough to see Dr. Ashworth's conviction and the congressional hearings that exposed the full scope of the government's medical experiments on native populations. The scandal had reached all the way to Washington, resulting in new laws requiring informed consent for any medical treatment of indigenous peoples and establishing tribal rights to traditional healing practices. "Rebecca," Thomas called from his office where he was reviewing architectural plans for the new school they were building. "Judge Parker is here to see you." Federal Judge William Parker, whose own grandson had died at Carlisle School, had become an unexpected champion of Native rights. His rulings had established legal precedents that protected tribal sovereignty while ensuring access to modern medical care. "Judge Parker," Rebecca greeted the distinguished gray-haired man warmly. "What brings you all the way from Santa Fe?" "Good news," Parker replied, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "The Supreme Court has agreed to hear the case of Running Bear of United States. Your lawsuit against the government for the medical experiments is going to the highest court in the land." Rebecca felt her heart skip a beat. The lawsuit, filed on behalf of all Apache families who had suffered under Dr. Ashworth's programs, sought not just financial compensation, but formal acknowledgement of the government's wrongdoing and guarantees that such atrocities would never happen again. "What are our chances?" she asked. "Better than I dared hope," Parker admitted. "The evidence is overwhelming, and public opinion has shifted dramatically since the congressional hearings. The newspapers have been following your work here at the medical center. and people across the country are beginning to understand that Native Americans aren't obstacles to progress. They're contributors to it. Thomas joined them, his arms sliding naturally around Rebecca's waist. The marriage of the Apache railroad millionaire and the mixed heritage nurse had initially scandalized territorial society, but their joint work in establishing the medical center and school had gradually won over even the most prejudiced critics. "Judge," Thomas said, "we've been thinking about expanding the program. Rebecca's treatment methods are getting requests from reservations across the Southwest. What would we need to do legally to establish satellite clinics?" "That's actually part of why I'm here," Parker replied. "The territorial governor wants to meet with you both. He's proposing state funding for a network of integrated medical facilities that combine traditional and modern healing methods." Rebecca exchanged a look of amazement with Thomas. 3 years ago, the territorial government had been actively trying to destroy Apache communities. Now they were asking for help in improving health care for everyone. "There's something else," Parker continued, his expression growing more serious. "Dr. Ashworth died in federal prison last week. Apparently he never recovered from the shame of his conviction. His family has asked if you would consider speaking at a memorial service about forgiveness and healing." Rebecca felt a complex mixture of emotions. The man who had tried to poison Apache children, who had conducted horrific medical experiments in the name of racial superiority, was dead. She should feel satisfaction, but instead she felt mostly sadness for the brilliant doctor who had allowed grief and prejudice to corrupt his healing mission. "I'll consider it," she said quietly. "Hatred only breeds more hatred. Maybe his death can become part of the healing process." That evening, as the family gathered for dinner in their modest home near the medical center, Rebecca reflected on how dramatically their lives had changed. The simple wooden table was surrounded by voices speaking English, Apache, and Spanish as their extended family, including several Apache elders, Dr. Whitman, Marshall Henderson and his wife, and 2 young Apache men studying to become the first Native American physicians, shared food and conversation. Blue Flower, now Rebecca's assistant at the medical center, brought her 3-year-old son to sit beside his honorary grandmother. The boy who had nearly died in a difficult birth was now a healthy, laughing child who spoke both Apache and English fluently. "Grandmother Rebecca," he said in his clear child's voice, "tell us the story about the night grandfather found you in the desert." Rebecca smiled, remembering that terrifying night when she had stumbled through the darkness, bleeding and afraid, only to be rescued by a man whose love would transform both their lives. "Well," she began, "it was a very dark night, and I was very lost." As she told the familiar story, Rebecca noticed Thomas listening with the same rapt attention as the children. Even after 3 years of marriage, he still marveled at the series of coincidences and choices that had brought them together. "And then what happened?" prompted Peace, though he knew the story by heart. "Then your father made a choice," Rebecca continued, looking at Thomas across the table. "He could have taken me to the authorities and collected a reward. Instead, he chose to protect a stranger because it was the right thing to do." "But you weren't really strangers," observed Dr. Whitman. "You were both Apache, both healers, both people who believed that love was stronger than hate. That's the most important part of the story," Chief Joseph Running Bear's adopted daughter Morning Star added. She had returned to the canyon after years of forced attendance at a government boarding school, bringing with her a determination to preserve Apache culture while embracing useful elements of white education. Sometimes the spirits bring people together exactly when they're needed most. After dinner, Rebecca and Thomas walked together through the gardens behind their house, where traditional Apache medicinal plants grew alongside roses and vegetables. The desert air was cool and sweet, filled with the sounds of night birds and distant music from the Apache settlement that had rebuilt itself on land legally purchased with Thomas's railroad profits. Do you ever regret it? Thomas asked, taking her hand as they walked. Giving up your chance at a respectable life in Boston society? Rebecca laughed, the sound carrying pure joy across the desert night. Regret finding my real family? Regret learning to heal with both my hands and my heart? Regret marrying the most stubborn, brave, wonderful man in Arizona territory? She stopped walking and turned to face him. Thomas Running Wolf Sterling, I have never regretted a single moment of our life together. Even when we were facing down federal cavalry and dodging poison-throwing doctors? Especially then, Rebecca replied firmly. Those were the moments when we discovered who we really were. Thomas pulled her close, marveling as he always did at the strength in her small frame. I love you, Rebecca Running Bear Sterling, more than my own life. And I love you, she whispered against his chest. Forever and always. Above them, the Arizona stars stretched endlessly across the desert sky, the same stars that had witnessed their first meeting in the darkness. But now, instead of fear and uncertainty, the night was filled with hope and the quiet contentment that came from building something meaningful together. In the distance, the lights of the Apache Medical Center glowed like beacons, drawing people from across the territory who needed healing. Tomorrow, Rebecca would welcome patients from 3 different tribes, 2 military posts, and the growing town of Thornton that had sprung up around their medical and educational facilities. She would use skills learned in Boston hospitals and Apache healing ceremonies, speaking languages that bridged cultures and treating patients with the understanding that true medicine healed not just bodies, but spirits. The little girl who had been raised in denial of her heritage had become a woman who helped others embrace their own complex identities. Rebecca, Thomas said softly, look. She followed his gaze to see their sons playing in the moonlight with a group of Apache and white children, their laughter echoing off the canyon walls. The next generation was growing up without the artificial barriers that had separated their parents' worlds, learning that difference was something to celebrate rather than fear. That's our real legacy, Rebecca said with deep satisfaction. Not the medical center or the school or even the legal victories. It's them, children who will never doubt that they belong exactly where they are. As they watch their sons play under the desert stars. Rebecca Running Bear. Sterling knew that the frightened young woman who had stumbled through the darkness 3 years ago had found not just safety, but purpose. She had discovered that home wasn't a place on a map, but the people who loved you enough to fight for your dreams, and in the morning she would wake up ready to heal whoever needed healing, love whoever needed loving, and build bridges wherever chasms existed between human hearts. The Cowboy Millionaire had indeed shocked the whole town by what he did when he found a lost girl in the night. He had chosen love over law, courage over comfort, and justice over personal safety. But the girl he rescued had shocked everyone even more by proving that sometimes the best way to find yourself is to dedicate your life to helping others find their way home. Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about perfect people finding each other. They're about broken souls choosing to heal together. Rebecca and Thomas's journey reminds us that it's never too late to discover who we're truly meant to be, even when life has knocked us down repeatedly. At 55, 65, or beyond, we still have the power to write new chapters filled with purpose and passion. Their story proves that the love we've been searching for often comes disguised as service to others, that our deepest wounds can become our greatest sources of strength, and that family isn't just blood, it's the people who choose to stand with us when the world turns against us. Rebecca found her heritage by embracing both her Apache roots and her Boston training, showing us that we don't have to choose between our past and our future. Thomas discovered that real wealth comes from using our resources to lift others up. Together, They built something that outlasted their own lives, a legacy of healing that bridged divided worlds. What broken dreams in your own life might actually be preparing you for something more beautiful than you ever imagined? Have you ever found unexpected purpose in your pain, turning your struggles into strength for others?